I'm Tina Shadden, and we're here at the home of Bill and Miriam Shadden to interview Bill Shadden today. It's Saturday, February 26, 2011. Okay, tell us first when and where you were born.
I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and moved to Georgia when I was 4 years old. Moved to Cartersville when I was 8 years old. So I hate to admit it, I've been here 72 years.
Okay. How did your family come to Cartersville in Bartow County?
My father worked in a small bank in Chickamauga, Georgia, which is up near Chickamauga Park in Chattanooga. And he came to Cartersville in 1939 to be the head of the bank, First National Bank of Cartersville, because the previous president had died.
And who was the previous president?
Mr. Charlie Bylam, of course. I never knew Mr. Charlie
Okay.
because he was already deceased when we came here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, describe your childhood in Cartersville and if you had any siblings.
Well, I do have a brother who is 7 years younger, so until I got to be quite a bit older, we were not that close. We're close now and get along very well. One thing I wanted to tell you, when I came here, I went to the 3rd grade at Market Street School. And I bet a lot of people don't know what Market Street School is or was, which is now, of course, is Cherokee Avenue.
Mm-hmm. And
Miss Pearl Goodwin was my teacher. And she had been around for quite a long time because there was a gentleman here named Fred Knight, who was Frederick Knight's grandfather, who was born about 1890, and Miss Pearl taught him in the 3rd grade.
Wow.
So she had been around for quite a few years. And there were 2 other ladies that were quite well known here with teachers. One of them was Miss Dinks Irick and Miss Maggie Irick. Miss Maggie Irick taught in the Douglas Street School, which was the equivalent of the Cherokee Avenue School. And Miss Dinks taught the 2nd grade, so I never had the privilege of having her.
Right.
They lived
sisters?
They were sisters,
Mm-hmm.
and they lived in the house, which is now the Family Life Center of the Episcopal Church.
Okay.
That was their house.
That was the Irick house.
That was the Irick house. Okay. And one thing that always pleased me, not because Miss Maggie died or Miss Dinks died, but I was the executor of Miss Dinks' will as she passed on.
Mm-hmm.
And but they were lovely ladies, and all the teachers were so interesting. And there were 7 grades of grammar school and 4 grades of high school. And Miss Kennedy was my 7th grade teacher, and Miss Sproul Kennedy, she lived at the corner of Burnt Hickory and Mission Road.
Mm-hmm.
And one time she had us there to pick cotton.
Oh, really?
It didn't take me very long to realize I didn't want to be a farmer.
Okay. That's a good thing.
But she was a very interesting lady. She was at the time an old maid,
Mm-hmm.
and later got married. But she was tough, but when you got through, you knew that you had been taught. And I wanted to tell a story about something that happened while I was there. We had a softball game. The 7th grade from Cherokee played the 7th grade from Douglas Street. And Douglas Street had 4 large boys, and we had a bunch of runts. So we played, and they beat us 15-11. And seems as though every time they needed a hit, they sent one of these large people up, and nobody was keeping the line up, so it got a little bit out of hand. So the next game, Miss Sproul Kennedy kept the scorecard, and every time somebody wanted to come to bat, she would look at the scorecard, and if it wasn't your time, you didn't come up. We won 11-1 that time. So anyway, she was quite an interesting lady, but a wonderful teacher.
Very fair, seems.
Well, she was fair, but she was tough.
Yeah.
But all of us needed that.
Yeah.
Then I went to Cartersville High School, which was next door to the grammar school.
Mm-hmm.
The building is now gone.
But is it in the area where the library
Not that,
is?
no, it's right if you come out of the front door of the Cherokee School and turn to the left, it was sitting right on the same piece of property.
Oh, okay. Next door.
Right next door. And interesting thing, our church started in 1983, and we used the Stiles Auditorium in the Cherokee School.
And what's your church?
Trinity Methodist Church.
Right. Okay.
And we were there for 2.5 years, I guess. And then I went to high school, and a lot of interesting things I thought happened to me. And one of the things that they don't do now, and they did do when I went to high school, all of the boys got to run, and people hit them with belts.
Oh.
Called the belt line, and that kept you pretty straight until you got through with that. And they initiated the girls too. They made them wear their dresses inside out, and they painted their faces these awful colors.
Really?
And that, I think, stopped about a year or so after I got out of high school. But it was a good high school. But they started the 12th grade, which added to grammar school. So 2 of the 3 years I was in high school, we didn't have but 3 classes. And right next to the high school was the home economics building, which is now, as far as I can remember, the Montessori school. And then I graduated, and as my father said, he went to college, and it was a 4-year course, 6-year course, and some people finished it in 4, and that was me.
Tell us where the gymnasium was when you were in high school.
It was where the building is now, but it was a wooden building, which after I got out of school burned down, and that replaced it. And right up between that and the library was where we had the softball game. That's where the football team practiced. It was a flat field, which is not flat anymore. It's a parking lot.
Right. Okay. What neighborhood did you grow up in? Where did you live in Cartersville when you
I
lived
lived
here?
just off Cassville Road in what we called Howard Heights on Hillside Drive. And one of my claims to fame is I lived across the street from Jimmy Dellins.
Right. Who was your classmate?
Was my classmate in high school. That's correct.
And who were your neighbors? You know,
Mr. Pete Gilreath ran Gilreath Hardware, which is no longer on, but it's near where Young Brothers drugstore.
Right.
One of the things that I did that I remember quite well, everybody I think has heard of Miss Mary Lou's Pink Kindergarten. Well, I was a teenager, and one of my favorite things was to sell tickets for the recital to the Pink Kindergarten.
Really?
Yes. And I played, when I was younger, I played with Bill Harvey, who was the nephew of Miss Mary Lou. And Miss Mary Lou, of course, was Mr. Will Young of Young Brothers' daughter.
Right.
But there are a lot of very pleasant memories.
Yeah. Did you go to Miss Mary Lou's Pink Kindergarten?
No, I didn't. I was already past that.
Okay, that's right. You were in the 3rd grade.
But I think my brother Blocker was the only person who ever went there 4 years.
Oh. Did it take him 4 years to learn?
I don't really know that.
Kindergarten?
It's a good question. But when he was 3 years old, he went to Miss Mary Lou's kindergarten.
Okay.
And of course, there was no public kindergarten
Right.
then.
It was private.
It was private. That's right.
Okay. Now, after you grew up and you moved away and you came back, what neighborhood did you live in then?
Davis subdivision on Boatner Avenue.
Right.
And we lived there 17 years.
And that was like a housing development.
Well, it was where they had the housing project when they built the dam in 48, 49, 50. And we lived there. All those houses were gone. But we lived on the land where those houses were. And there had been a store right across the street, and it was converted to a house, and it's still there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it dates to 1948.
Right.
No, the workers that lived there, they lived in small houses, individual houses.
Right. It was not unlike the Goodyear Village.
Okay.
because they did tear them down
Mm-hmm.
after that, and that's when they built most of them are brick
Mm-hmm.
houses.
Who was the Davis, that
Well,
developed it?
Mr. R.T. Davis ran the Davis Smart Shop,
Mm-hmm.
which was in downtown Cartersville, and he lived right behind us,
Mm-hmm.
and in one of the houses.
Mm-hmm.
And he and Mr. Luke Pettit, I think, who was the chairman of the Cartersville Bank.
Uh-huh.
Because when we first came here, there wasn't but one bank,
Right. It's just First National.
the First National, which of course became Wachovia and now is Wells Fargo.
Right. And you moved here to Walnut Drive, or is this Driver Avenue?
Yeah, Walnut Drive.
Walnut
yeah.
Drive. And y'all moved here.
I moved here. We moved here when one of our sons was a senior in high school and one was a freshman. One of them happens to be your husband.
Right. And you've been here, what did you say, 33 years?
Almost 34.
34 years.
Right. It's a wonderful area. It's generally quiet,
Right.
and peaceful.
And what do they call this neighborhood? Does it have a
It
name?
used to be called Conyers Subdivision, is
Okay.
all we ever knew.
Okay.
Because it had one time it belonged to the Conyers family that owned a great deal of property.
Right. And what year were most of these houses built that were part of that subdivision?
I think they started building them about 1973,
Okay.
and this one was built in 76.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting. A friend, in fact, a person that worked for me, lived up on Bob White Trail, which is up on the top of the hill,
Mm-hmm.
and he lived there for a year before the street was paved.
Oh,
It was quite
very,
interesting.
very new, yes.
That's right.
Okay, now let's talk about your occupations. Or did you want to talk about your education first?
Well,
that was more
after, as I
chronological.
say, I finished the 6-year course and graduated from Georgia Tech, and I went to work, and then I had to go in the service.
Right.
And I was in the Air Force for 2 years. And then I came back and I went to work for IBM in 1957.
Where were you stationed when you were in the Air Force?
I really had a real tough assignment. I was in Phoenix for a year,
Uh-huh.
and then I got transferred to Reno,
Uh-huh.
then to Las Vegas because I was in the finance end of it, and I was the only single finance officer, so every time they wanted to move somebody, they moved me.
Okay.
But it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
If you can imagine, I know if you haven't been there, you've seen pictures. Las Vegas had 50,000 people when I lived there. And recently 50,000 moved there every year.
Oh, man.
And Reno was not as big as Rome.
So it was before their big population.
But
That's
they were
cool.
wonderful places to live.
Yeah.
And in a way I was lucky because I was a finance officer and it was illegal for me to gamble.
Oh, that helped, didn't
Yeah,
it?
because
have a
one of
problem
my
with that.
predecessors had extended himself.
Oh, no.
I never did know who, but that was the story that was
Okay.
told anyway.
So they made that a rule.
Yeah,
That you couldn't
definitely.
gamble.
It was an Air Force regulation
Okay.
against, but it was a real good experience. I did not mind being in the service.
Mm-hmm.
I had a good time.
Mm-hmm.
I was single and met some really terrific people. And it's interesting, I had never been out west,
Mm-hmm.
how different the climate is, but it's a terrific place to
Yeah.
live.
And y'all have made trips back since then, I
Yes,
know.
we have, and always have been very enjoyable.
Right.
Went with my brother several times,
Uh-huh.
who happens to like to go to Las Vegas
And gamble.
and gamble. He's a big gambler. He probably maybe spends $100 a
Oh,
week
wow.
when he's there.
Okay, you want to tell us about your occupation and how you came to...
Okay, I was with IBM for 3 years, and
This was after you were in the service.
after
You
I was
came
in the
back.
service,
Mhm.
and
How did you get to IBM? Did you just know they...
well, my aunt was connected with the University of Chattanooga, and she had heard through some friends that IBM was hiring people that liked math. Well, I happen to like math,
Yes.
so I applied for the job in Atlanta,
Mm-hmm.
and they did hire me. I always thought it was kind of interesting that the assistant manager in Atlanta was the person that interviewed me, and since then he's been CEO of IBM.
Oh, really?
So they didn't hold that against him.
Okay.
But I was in a training program which lasted 14 weeks. And 14 weeks, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, is pretty tough as far as I was concerned. Anyway, down toward the end of it, I believe I'd had enough training. And they called me in and said, we're going to send you to computer school. And computers were really new at that time.
Yes.
So I went to computer school for a week, and the boss called me in that Friday afternoon and said, guess what you're going to do Monday? I said, well, I don't know. What am I going to do Monday? He said, you're going to Warner Robins Air Force Base and teach this course. I said, what? But anyway, I went and I studied the night before. He said, one thing you remember, you know more than they do. But IBM was a great place to work.
Mm-hmm.
They really treated you, even though they had 90,000 employees,
Yeah.
they treated you like you were somebody.
Right.
But I guess I always had it in my mind I'd like to come back here.
Mm-hmm.
So I got the opportunity after 3 years.
Right.
And came back, and I was in the bank for 20 years.
Right.
I want to tell a banking story, if I
All
may.
right. Tell us the banking story.
When my father first came here, of course,
Uh-huh.
he didn't know anybody anyway.
Right.
The FBI came to the bank and said there's been a rumor out that the bank's going to be robbed. Well, of course, nobody liked that idea. But in the bank, right above the vault, was a little kind of a opening, and the FBI man sat up there every night and watched to make sure that nobody came to rob the bank.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, one day, this pretty disreputable person came in the front door, and my father said to Mr. Fred Knight, who was an officer of the bank, said, this is it, Fred. Said, he's here. And Mr. Knight just almost fell in the floor laughing, and he finally walked over to Dad and said, he's one of the most prominent people in town. So,
And owned a business.
yeah, he was a local businessman, but he had the job where he did tend to get dirty and that sort of thing. But Mr. Knight just had a fit. He thought that was the greatest thing.
Because your dad had no idea who it was.
They didn't have
He was
any
new in
idea.
town.
He'd only been here about 2 weeks,
Right.
I think.
Right.
But I got another banking story. We had a problem after I'd been here 12 years, and one of the officers borrowed several $1 million that didn't belong to him.
Oh, okay.
So obviously this caused a great deal of problems. So the day that the thing came out happened to be Valentine's Day of 1972.
Uh-huh.
Now why do I remember that? I just do.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm out at one of the stations where you could make a deposit or write a check.
Mm-hmm.
And Reverend Mitchell from the Baptist Church came up and was doing something. I said, preacher, I have never asked anybody to do this, but would you say a prayer for me today? He says, I'm making a deposit. Is that not good enough? So in everything, there's bad and there's good. But another story that happened, one of our ladies, well, we didn't know whether the bank was going to fold or what was going to happen.
After that.
After that. And one of the ladies, one of our lady officers, got a phone call from an elderly lady, and her voice was just quivering, and she said, I've got everything that I own in my life is in that bank. Would you please go check my accounts and make sure they're all right? So she said, oh yeah, I will, and I'll call you back. So she came to me and she said, I've got to call her back. She's got $15 in her checking account and $5 in savings, and that we think is going to be safe.
Yes.
So in everything, there's good and bad in everything. One of the things that I've noticed living here, you get to be friends with some people that you don't really have anything in common.
Mm-hmm.
One of my banking friends was a guy named Sam Simmons,
Mm-hmm.
who lived out on Burnt Hickory Road and had the sale barn.
Right.
It has the cattle sale every
Uh-huh.
Saturday.
Right.
And a childhood friend of mine was his bookkeeper. And they used voucher checks. They were 3 checks, 3 to a page,
Uh-huh.
with interleaved carbon, and they were quite expensive even
Right.
for that time.
Right.
So anyway, John came in one day and said, I've got to order some more voucher checks. And I said, John, you just got some about 2 weeks ago. He said, yeah, but the goats got in and ate them. So he had to order some more checks.
Those are expensive feed for the
Yeah,
goats.
that's exactly right.
Okay, now, you were at the bank for how long?
21 years.
And your father was there before you.
Right,
Because when he came here, he was the bank president
yes.
for many years.
Well, and another interesting thing to me is that Joe Shadden, my son,
Right.
was in banking for 12 years, and he was 4th generation.
Right.
Because my grandfather worked at the Hamilton National Bank in Chattanooga for many years, and then my father, and then and of course his brother and myself.
Did you say you had an uncle who was a banker
Yes,
also?
he was. Yeah,
So
he
there were
was.
several people.
He was in the Hamilton National Bank too.
And you said your grandfather, he actually died in the
He
bank.
died. He physically died in the bank.
Yeah.
He dropped
He had a
dead
heart
of a
attack.
heart attack.
Yeah. Okay. And when your father was the bank president, you came to work there. Is that
Yes.
right? But he did not ask you to come to work
He
there.
did not. He didn't disapprove of it,
Right.
but he didn't hire me.
He could have, I guess.
He
if
could have. Another person. One day, my father was a very reasonable, understanding person, and he virtually never asked me to do anything that he didn't think I should do. But anyway, one day he came about, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He says, "Are you ready?" I said, "Am I ready for what?" He said, "We're going to the Bloodmobile." I said, "I've never been to the Blood." We said, "Well, you're going today." So I went to the Bloodmobile, and I ended up giving 5 gallons, and it was one of the most worthwhile things I ever did, I think. But he just walked in and said, "We are going." And,
okay.
and you know, when the boss says you're going, generally you're going.
Yeah, even if you're going to give blood. Yeah.
That's right.
Yes. Tell us about when the bank was remodeled. Your father was working there. Were you working there when the bank was
we
remodeled?
were both there. It was in 1966.
And tell us why the bank was remodeled.
Okay. Nobody probably but me has ever noticed this, but as you're going east on Main Street and you come to Irwin Street, the sidewalk has been moved back about 5 feet in front of what used to be the First National Bank. And the reason for that, well, they were going to get all the businesses to move back, and we're
In that
going to
block.
widen Main Street.
Right.
But we were the only ones that ever moved the sidewalk
Right.
back and wide, so it never did get wide.
Right. So that's why you had to remodel the front of the building.
Right.
Was because they wanted to move the sidewalk.
Well, and we actually remodeled inside also.
Okay.
And there was a person, the man who did the remodeling, worked for the Bank Building Corporation and had done this sort of thing in many places. And he was from St. Louis, Missouri, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But
He said
anyway,
that he worked here for a period.
he did, and he had one of the most interesting experiences. He had a friend in St. Louis who was just lazy. He was married and wouldn't do anything, wouldn't work, didn't have a job, and his wife was always bugging him to do stuff around the house. And one day she got him to paint one of the rooms, and she came in, and he had taken a coat hanger and bent it like that and put cloth around it, and he was using he invented the paint roller.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, I always thought that was a good story, but
Yeah.
he told it for the truth. And
Uh-huh. Okay.
but the bank had big columns on it, which
Right.
it doesn't have
Right.
anymore. They really completely changed the look of it.
Some more modern
Yes.
look than
Yeah.
the old bank. The bank was began when? What was the original bank was started in?
1889.
Okay.
And that building was built in 1905.
Okay. Where was the bank before they had that building?
I don't know.
On the corner, okay.
I do not.
But in a different
There were
location.
two banks that merged into the First National, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you when. I think it was in the 1910.
Mm-hmm.
I think they had a banking problem like we've had recently,
Right.
and the two banks couldn't make it separately and went together.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed in some of the old newspapers, they'll have a page from the bank, and it'll have list all the assets.
Yeah.
And that was a common practice.
Yes.
In earlier times.
I would say probably annually they do something like that. I never did think it had too much meaning, but that's just what banks did at that time.
I always wondered if it was just to assure the people that, you know.
Supposedly it was
Yeah.
I won't say propaganda, but it was it was information.
Right, exactly.
There you go.
Okay. Now, since what were the positions you held at the bank when you worked for the bank?
I was an assistant vice president, and I was a senior vice president, and then I was the president.
Okay.
I was the president for 7 years, and the bank was sold, and they thought they could bring in another president, which they did.
Okay.
So I became an accountant.
Okay. When you were, you're very visible in the community when you were in those positions. What civic organizations were you involved with during those times?
I was president of the Chamber of Commerce 2 years,
Okay.
which was a little unusual. Usually 1 year was the term.
Mm-hmm.
And the Advocates for Children were started, and almost anything, the March of Dimes.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how long I was treasurer of the March of Dimes, but a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that happened to me that I was really proud of, in 1965, I was elected Young Man of the Year, and it's really nice to have other people recognize you as having done some things.
Right. Well, that was nice.
But this is a wonderful place to live, and you've lived here long enough to know that.
Yes.
But I've never had any regrets about coming back.
Mm-hmm.
It was nice for our boys to grow up and go to school here and even play against Dexter.
Friendly rivalry.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, and were you involved in the Rotary clubs? Rotary clubs are very big here in Cartersville.
I was in the Rotary for 25 years.
Yes.
And I was president, I think 1971, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Now, is it the same Rotary club your father was in? Okay.
At that time, there was only one. Now I believe there are three.
Yes. The churches that you attended here in Cartersville?
We started out at Sam Jones Methodist Church and went there for a number of years, and then when Trinity started in 1983, we moved there.
Mm-hmm. And I've always thought this was interesting. Your parents stayed at Sam Jones Methodist Church, right?
When my mother had died.
Okay, she was already
My
passed
father
away.
did stay at Sam Jones.
Okay. And what were some of the major changes you've seen in Bartow County in your lifetime, or what are some of the biggies anyway?
If I may, let me use automobile loans as a
That's
gauge.
a good one.
If you want to buy an automobile now, there are loans up to 7 years, 84 months.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me go backwards on this story. I bought my first new car in 1955.
Uh-huh.
Financed it for 2 years, and that's all you could do.
Really?
Prior to that, the man who used to be at the First National Bank was not real keen about automobiles. And one day...
He didn't think they were going to last.
No.
Right?
One day, this very prominent man, substantial man, came in and said he wanted to borrow some money. I don't remember how much. I'm going to say $700 or $800, which in the 30s was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so the banker took a note out and started writing the note out by hand. They didn't type notes out in that time. And he said, by the way, he said, what are you going to use this money for? He said, well, I'm going to buy me a car. And he tore the note up and he said, "Not with our money, you're not." Now that's that's how automobile loans have evolved
Right.
over
Yes.
a long period of time.
Yes. What about Interstate 75 coming to Cartersville? And
All right, when I first came back in 1960, Highway 41 was the way you got from.
tell us the route of Highway 41 through Cartersville. Where did it come into town?
Originally, it came in on Tennessee Street.
Okay.
And everybody knows where the four-way lunch is.
Yes.
Well, that was where the highway went.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a four-way stop there.
Uh-huh.
And that's where the name of the restaurant came from.
Mm-hmm.
And it went out Cassville Road.
Okay.
It went up by the courthouse, out Cherokee, and turned right on Cassville Road.
Mm-hmm.
And went, in fact, the road to Adairsville now is not changed much.
Right.
Going out by Cass High School,
Mm-hmm.
old Cass High School,
Mm-hmm. Right.
old Cass
Yeah.
High School. And that's the way it went. There wouldn't be any way for the traffic to do that now.
Right, yeah.
Well, when I was growing up, I started driving before I had a license. I couldn't tell my sons that.
And was that a problem that you
No.
drove? No, not a
No.
problem.
I'd drive around town, I'd pass the state patrolman, I'd wave, and they'd wave. They knew I didn't have a license. So the day I got my license, I went to the state patrol office, which was in town.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what I had to do for my test?
I don't know.
Go out and drive around the block. So I went out and drove around the block by myself.
He didn't even get
No,
started.
he didn't even go with me. So I mean, things have changed.
Very
to say.
relaxed.
Oh, another thing has changed so much, and it's kind of gone full circle, I think. When we first came here, the Grand Theater had a movie on Monday and Tuesday,
Mm-hmm.
then another feature on Wednesday, another one on Thursday and Friday,
Right,
and the cowboy pictures on Saturday, the double feature.
right,
No movies on Sunday.
right.
And all of them were at night except on Saturday.
Okay.
And now, of course, the Grand is back to doing wonderful things and looks better than it ever has. And
Right,
my mother liked to go to the movies because there was no television.
right. Mm-hmm.
But on Saturday, we'd always go to the movie. It was awful. You had to pay 9 cents to get in. A pack of cough drops cost almost as much as the movie did. But it was fun.
Did you like cough drops?
I did. I loved cough drops. And I still do.
Which,
The lozenges that my wife takes, I like.
What, do you have a favorite flavor or something? I mean,
There used to be two.
most people don't like cough drops.
Oh, I do.
Because most people talk about going to the movies and they talk about getting popcorn and.
But that costs too much.
But you bought cough drops.
I bought
at
cough
the
drops.
concession stand.
There was one that cost a nickel and one that cost a dime. And the day with the dime, with the 10-cent ones were much better.
Okay. Oh my goodness.
Of course, I like paregoric, so everybody thinks I'm weird.
Okay, now tell us what paregoric is.
It's
Nobody's
something,
going to know
I'm
that.
not sure I know what it's for, but it's something to do with if you got a cold. I
Okay,
think.
they used to give you paregoric.
It gave you paregoric.
Okay, okay. And you liked it.
I like,
Okay.
still do.
Did you like castor oil?
No.
Okay, that was really bad.
But I was fortunate. I never did have to take castor oil.
That's good. Because I've heard other people describe it, that it was terrible.
It's not too good.
Yeah. Okay, tell us about what downtown looked like. You lived here when you were a child, and what did the downtown area look like?
The downtown still looks nice, but it does not, to me, look that different
Uh-huh.
from when Ross's Diner looks just like Ross's Diner looked like. The four-way looks just like it
Right.
did. I don't think it's really changed, and I say that in a positive way.
Right.
But it hasn't changed. all
Because
that
so
much.
many downtowns and small towns have changed.
I did want to mention that when we moved here,
Uh-huh.
Cartersville had 6,000 people.
Oh.
Marietta had 9,000 people.
Oh, my goodness.
Cobb County is bigger than Wyoming now in population.
I didn't know that.
The other day I got curious about the population, And the thing I saw said that there were 96,000 people in Bartow County.
Mm-hmm.
There are 102,000 vehicles.
Wow.
Now, this came off the same report that I saw.
Yeah.
But things are quite different.
Mm-hmm.
The traffic here is quite different.
Yes.
Somebody that knows told me about 10 years ago that there's more traffic on 41 now than when it was the main highway.
Uh-huh. I would think so.
The interstate opened in 1977.
Mm-hmm. And Cartersville was the last leg.
Yes.
The exit into Cartersville was the last leg of the
That's
interstate.
right. Yeah, it was a long time. It was, and they even completed it still down near Emerson. It was not,
Mm-hmm.
but it has certainly made a tremendous difference.
Right.
But I've lived a very interesting and rewarding life for me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, if a person wants to go back to the way it used to be, go to Ross's for lunch.
Right.
I've never been in Ross's that I haven't seen somebody maybe I hadn't seen for years.
Right.
It's such an interesting place to be.
It's a cross section of life.
It
there at
is.
Ross's.
It really
Yeah.
is.
You could see anybody there.
And everybody who goes in there seems to be happy to be there, and they're friendly,
Right.
even though they don't know you.
Mm-hmm.
The other day, I don't know, probably a year ago, I was sitting in Ross's, and there was a young man. He was young to me. And the guy with him said, "Don't you live in Seattle now?" He said, "Yes." Said, "I moved to Seattle 20 years ago from Cartersville."
Uh-huh.
He works at Boeing, I think.
Oh.
And the guy said, "The first thing you decided to do when you came back was eat at Ross's?" He said, "That's exactly right." Said, "After I said hello to my family, I went to Ross's for breakfast,"
Yeah, well,
I think it
the
was.
saying is just when you got to have Ross's, you know.
That's right.
Are there any other stories that you'd like to tell us?
One about when I was at the bank.
Okay.
One day, the chief of police called me and said, "Would you come up here?" And I thought, I will, but I don't really want to.
Yeah.
But anyway, we were friends. And so I went up there, and he said, "Rumor has it that they're going to abduct you,
Because
kidnap me."
Right, because you knew the
I knew a lot
ball.
of things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so that night, a deputy sheriff spent the night with me sitting in my den. He had a sawed-off shotgun with him. Nothing happened.
Mm-hmm.
The next day, a police car came, picked me up, my son Neil, your husband, and his brother Joe, took them to school and took me to the bank, and it was an unmarked police car. And my son Neil said, "Well, it's a plain blue wrapper, isn't it, Daddy?"
Yeah. He'd already figured it
Yeah,
out.
and nothing ever
Right.
happened, thank goodness. But that's not a very good feeling.
I guess not, to have someone with a
Yeah.
sawed-off shotgun in
That's
your
right.
living room. Is there anything else?
I think I talked more than I should
Okay.
already.
Well, thank you.
You really given me a treat. I've looked forward to doing
Oh,
this.
good. I'm glad. I know when we used to just sit around and visit, you'd always, you and Miriam both had great stories.
Well, and I didn't make all these up either.
No. True stories.
Can I ask 4 questions?
Okay.
All your family they were bankers.
Uh-huh.
So growing up, was your family more affluent than other families around you?
When now not my grandfather, but when my father came down here, bankers did not make tremendous salaries. I mean, we got by. I never did go hungry, let's put it that way. But I never did have a car of my own, and things are quite a bit different now. And as I say, we lived in a nice house. We made house payments just like everybody else did. I did here.
Did you have friends who had cars? I mean,
No.
Nobody
No.
did though.
My senior year in high school, there was one person in the class had a car.
Okay.
Of course, a lot of people live close. I lived
Yeah.
so close, I could walk to school.
Yeah, it's not like today.
Yeah, I walked every day.
Mhm.
It didn't hurt me.
All right.
But it's quite different. But I think banking was a very respected profession. One of the nice things that happens to me, I have people 2 or 3, 4 times a year will come up to me and say, "You don't remember me, but you made me my first loan." And now, not the ones I turned down.
Can I just say something too? Since I've been married to his son Neil for 23 years, when I first came here, I was single for a couple of years and nobody knew who I was. Then I married into the Shadden family, and we would have people like at church when we went out to eat, and they would come up and they'd like thank Neil, because he was related to Bill. Because one guy in particular, every time we saw him, he'd say, "Your daddy made a loan to me so I could start my dry cleaning business, and I've just appreciated it because I know he didn't have to, because I wasn't a good risk, but he did, and we made a good business."
Ernestine, it was so different when I started. A person could come in and you made the loan based on who they were or who their father was. And I don't mean bankers don't do well now. I'm not saying that. I don't mean that. But you mainly, now, that's not to say every one of them got paid, but most of them did. And in a way, it was unfair, because if the father didn't pay his debts, the son a lot of times had trouble getting credit. So it could work both ways.
Yeah.
We have a guy in our church, and one day he came in with his cousin, another man. And he said, "You don't remember it, but you made both of us our first loan when we were 18 years old." One of them just died at 69, and I still remembered. So you don't remember all of them. Also, one guy came in one day to me and tried to get a loan, and I wouldn't lend him the money. I saw him the other day, and he said, "Do you remember you turned me down for that loan?" I said, "Well, I don't really remember it, but if you say so, I did." He said, "I'm worth $5 million now, and I can have anything I want." I said, "We make mistakes too."
My next question is, can you tell us how you met your wife?
I went to work out of Georgia Tech. I went to work for Southern Bell in accounting. And it was lucky because there were just lots of cute girls that worked for Southern Bell. So I started going with this girl. And one day I'm at the varsity. You do know what the varsity is.
A lot of people.
It was on Sunday afternoon. It was a day just about like this. And this convertible pulled out of the parking lot at the varsity. And there was a girl with a blonde ponytail. And she waved and we waved. And I asked this girl I was with, I said, "Who was that?" And she said, "That was my best friend." So anyway, after I came out of the service, I called her best friend. I've been married to her for 53 years, so almost.
And who is that?
Miss Miriam. But that was the girl with the long ponytail.
Yeah.
She doesn't have a ponytail anymore.
And she was Miriam Wilson, and she
Miriam
grew up
Wilson,
in Atlanta.
Yeah.
The Grant Park
She
area.
lived out near Grant Park. And the girl I dated lived near Grant Park. And she married somebody else, and I married the right one.
Sounds like you were really active in the Bartow community. Is there any project that you're really proud of that you helped for it to come about, either with the Rotary Club or the Chamber of Commerce? But is there anything that you think I helped with that, or
One time, I worked at cable television, and Mr. Osher and I talked about the fact that we needed scholarships And even though it was more, I don't know if it was my idea or his idea, but anyway, the Etowah Foundation came out of that, and I've
That
always
comes.
been extremely proud of that. Even though it was not my money that got it started, but I felt good about the fact that this is what we needed in Bartow County. There are a lot of great things here that I had parts in, but I didn't get them started. But that I feel like I helped to get it started.
What year was that?
I want to say it was 1982. I'm not positive that that's right, but that's about when it was.
And my last question, you kind of talked about this some. You know, the financial situation that our country is in right now, a lot of people want to blame the bankers or the banking practices. Or do you have any comment on that, about how banking is done now as opposed to when you were in banking?
Well, when I was in banking, everything that I knew about was the small town bank, like Mr. Burt Lance in Calhoun and banks like that. And the banks in Atlanta were so large, and of course still are. But I was involved with the community bankers, and they took part in almost everything. Nobody ever said to me, you need to go and do this or do that. You just kind of knew that that's what you needed to do. One thing I was thinking about, back when I was in the bank, I never thought about not banking, not doing business in Bartow County. I would never have bought a Honda that I drive now.
Outside of the county.
Outside, if it wasn't in Bartow County, not that I disliked people at other places, I just I wasn't interested in that. I thought I was supposed to do business here because that's where my livelihood was.
Mm-hmm.
I always felt like I was so lucky to live here. When I first came back here, I could walk to work in 15 minutes.
Huh.
And I never worked in Atlanta. I liked Atlanta, I still do. I worked in Atlanta 3 years, but I'm so glad I didn't have to go back and forth after that. Maybe I've rambled around, but it's a great place, though. I never talked to anybody that didn't like living here.